Okay, so for this writing workshop, I want to explore MTV Ghosted and the extent to which ghosting is ethical and justified. So I'll show you the prompt in just a second. So one of the things I mentioned in the group is this idea that when I allow my students to have assignments anchored in pop cultural relevancy, that I find that they do better with the assignment, and I get better submission rates when I do this, and the engagement goes up. So hopefully, if you decide to borrow this particular lesson or any of the other pop cultural things that I've done, you'll have some success with it as I have. So the other thing too is if you want, after watching this video, to have the PowerPoint presentation and the accompanying articles, you can email me at teachingwritingcoach@gmail.com. So teachingwritingcoach@gmail.com. So let's take a look at the prompt, and this is what I came up with. With the advent of online dating, the phenomena of ghosting has become quite prevalent. In this essay of 4 paragraphs in length, take a stance with regards to the ethics of ghosting in today's dating culture. So I'm going away from 5 paragraphs for this just to keep it simple. So I'm looking for intro, 2 bodies, and a conclusion is satisfactory enough. I imagine that you could probably do this. It might be a little too advanced for ninth graders, but 10th, 11th, 12th, and definitely for AP Lang. I ran it with my AP Lang students for a synthesis essay. So here's the thing. When I always present for teachers, I tell them this with regards to my templates. You have to Bob Ross your instruction. And here's what I mean by that. So imagine if Bob Ross goes on screen and says, "Hello, happy little people. Today we're going to paint a beautiful New England autumnal landscape with beautiful fall foliage. And in the center of our canvas, we're going to include a New England wood-covered bridge." He proceeds to sit there and paint at the canvas with his students. And oftentimes in the ELA classroom, we assign versus teach. So what you're going to see me do is explicitly teach by providing plenty of models and exemplars. Bob Ross used one template. He called it a heuristic, and it's called the wet on wet technique. And we are just going to use 3 heuristics or 3 templates to construct the whole essay. And I'll model for you how to incorporate those templates into the essay so that your students can write pretty seamlessly. So the question immediately is this: how do I write the introductory paragraph? And I tell my students that you can declare or invert the thesis. There's really no other there's no need to do anything else other than to declare or invert. You'll get a thesis if you adhere to the template, and that's pretty much what we want. That's half the battle. So in terms of declaring the thesis, I tell my students this: I want it to be 4 sentences long, exactly 4 sentences, because as you know, if left to their own devices, you may get a 16-sentence long introduction full of plot summation and all this extraneous stuff that's not relevant to getting anchored in a thesis. Or you might get the 1-sentence thesis that is just a dumping ground of literary terms or rhetorical terms and devices, and that's not what we want either. So I find 4 sentences to be enough space to be very succinct and precise and declarative with what they need to say. So when you declare, you take a look at the prompt, and in the very first sentence, you drop your thesis. So opening line, drop the thesis, address the question in the prompt. From there, it's context and background. I like to look for tier 2 level vocabulary, which is just basically your average run-of-the-mill SAT level word, and then sentence constructs. So my students are very well versed in this. I do nuance academies and word study academies, and I borrow something from Strunk and White. It's called Write It Right, and in it they assert that there are 12 different sentence constructs, that basically you can create a sentence 12 different ways. And my students have practiced that a lot to get away from the overuse of the short, simple declarative sentence. So probably as you've graded papers before, you see students go short, simple declarative sentence, short, simple declarative sentence, short, simple declarative sentence, and they completely overuse it to get that droning rhythm. So I think in order to have voice, rhythm, and flow, students need to be able to manipulate their syntax and wield all 12 of those in order to achieve that. So, and again, we're shooting for 4 sentences. If we invert, we're just going to flip it. So we're going to place the thesis in the last sentence, which means that you're going to begin with context and background. Sometimes students will try an analogy or a hook, and I have an example of that. It's kind of tricky. Your more advanced writers can pull that off. Still shooting for tier 2 level vocabulary for the academic tone, sentence constructs, and this one's going to be 4 sentences long as well. So let's take a look at both methods. So here it is. I'll just read it and then I'll unpack it. So in the world of dating, where ghosting is very prevalent, most relationships are not considered established in the early stages. Nevertheless, if one of the persons loses interest, they do have a moral obligation to state their feelings to the other. Just walking away without uttering a single word is not only cruel, it's ethically wrong. Therefore, ghosting is not something to be condoned. So here's the deal. The prompt is asking students to look at how ethical ghosting is. In some instances, it's okay to ghost. In others, it's not okay. So I tell my students, in your thesis statement, you probably want to have one word in there. Ethically, ethical, ethics, something of that nature, so that you're fully addressing the prompt. As we see here, the thesis is coming in the last sentence. So the student begins with context and background, and as they funnel it down towards that 4th sentence, they slip the thesis statement in there. So take a look at the sentence constructs, take a look at the vocab. Again, vocab's not over the top, it's within the student's wheelhouse, and those sentence constructs yield a good flow and a nice rhythm. So that's something that I look for in their writing. Here's another one, and this one is going the route of the hook or the analogy. Let's imagine an instance whereby someone is shopping for the perfect pair of skinny jeans. And let's also imagine someone on the dating scene trying to find their forever person. The person trying on the jeans is under no obligation to tell the sales clerk of the jeans that will not be purchased. And likewise, especially in early relationships, informing someone of your desire not to pursue the relationship further is not necessary or a requisite responsibility. So answers the prompt in the last sentence. And yet again, this is an example of an inverted one. The vocab is academic. The sentence constructs are varied. So it's doing everything that the template requires. And out of the gate, this student is off to a phenomenal start. So this is one of my better writers. So like the really exceptional writers can do this analogy or hook. And the struggling and emerging students, I just prefer that they have a simple thesis statement and not try to wow the reader. You kind of have to have a certain degree of skill and depth in order to pull this off. So here's a super simple one. And I tell my my struggling and emerging students, the ones that look at their blank sheet of paper or their blank screen and they say, I don't know what to do. I don't know how to begin. I tell them, just answer the question in the prompt and have that be your first sentence. So this is what this particular student did. They were really struggling to get started, and out of the gate, they just declared the thesis. Ghosting under any circumstances is ethically wrong. Do you see how the thesis is dropped right there? So that's an option. So up top or at the bottom is what I like to see. When feelings and emotions are involved, even if it is only a first date, the one doing the dumping has a moral obligation to let the other person down gently. It is the decent thing to do. People who are kind-hearted and compassionate get this basic truth. So every single one so far has been 4 sentences. thesis up top or thesis at the bottom, tier 2 sentence constructs. Here's one last one that this one qualified, I think, if I recall. Let me get through it and then we'll look at it. It is not a matter of ethics, but of circumstance. If one makes the decision to not pursue a prospective partner after a first or second date, there is not a moral obligation to inform this person of a lack of interest. But if the couple trespasses into intimacy, then ghosting is 100% ethically wrong. In the end, when considering right or wrong, what it comes down to is whether or not certain lines have been crossed. So this is another tack that another approach that the students could tackle this, and so sometimes they can qualify, and we see that some prompts with the FRQ1 on the Lang exam allow for that. So all are well done, well executed, and you see some degrees to which my students can write. So all of these out of the gate, I was pretty impressed with. Half the battle is get the thesis statement. So always 4 sentences, thesis up top, thesis at the bottom, your choice, and tier 2 and sentence constructs. That's the whole package for the declarative and the inverted. So the next question students might ask is, Mr. Kuhn, how do I write the body paragraphs? And I use something that comes from the Aristotelian tradition called the syllogistic method. And let me explain this real quick. So Aristotle ran a school called the Lyceum. And I could give you the whole history of this, but I'll be brief. It's pretty fascinating. And he would teach his students polemics, oration, the art of debate, word wrangling. And during these debates, he would say to himself, why does Jason always systematically win? And Wyeth is just kind of like, not so good. He's 50-50. And Todd just tank bombs every single time. Like, why is this? Did God come around on his gravy train and say, you will be endowed with the gift of the gab and you'll just be mediocre and you're going to tank bomb it every single time you enter the debate arena? And he said, no, I can't believe that. As a teacher, I cannot believe that this is an innate disposition and cognitive, from a congenital standpoint, like you either got it or you don't. He said, I have to believe that I can teach every student. So what he did was, in a way, open up the lid of the brains of the exceptional orators, and he came up with a eureka moment. He said, aha, I got it. The really good orators, the really good debaters argue syllogistically. And this is how he defined a syllogism. It's when you work cogently from premise to conclusion. So here's a real basic one. Premise 1, arsenic is deadly. Premise 2, my dog ate arsenic. Conclusion, my dog is going to die. When students argue, we want them to have a real deliberate line of reasoning. With my students, I call it cogency. And all I mean by that is get locked in logically. So be super crisp and be super clear with your logical progression of ideas and absolutely ensure that you have a line of reasoning. So in terms of breaking down the syllogistic method for the purposes of synthesis writing, here's what that looks like. So the first premise is going to be an argument that contains a why reason. So up top in the thesis, you're just answering the question in the prompt, yes, no, or maybe, or it depends. So in the first premise, you're going to say, why am I saying yes in the thesis? Why am I saying no in the thesis? Why am I qualifying in the thesis? So you just give a reason. And you're going to see in a second here, every single time my students write a first premise, it's going to be 3 sentences long. And the reason for that is, and I borrow this from the College Board, but I even if I'm teaching 9th graders synthesis, I say your argument must be central. And if the student takes 3 sentences to get a centralized argument, then they guarantee themselves, for the most part, that they're not going to plot summarize the sources or piggyback the sources so much that their argument gets lost. So I like to see that maneuver done in 3 sentences. The second premise is going to be textual support. And I like to see a good teeter-totter balance between quoting and paraphrasing. And the conclusion is where the textual analysis is held. So I tell my students that the first premise is a promise. So you want to have a link back to the promise, to the premise at the end of the syllogism, and then you want to hear the echo of the prompt and the thesis. So we want to hear something about ethics in the end of the syllogistic body paragraph. So all three maneuvers here are part of one body paragraph. And students often ask, Mr. Kuhn, how many sentences is a syllogistic body paragraph? And as we know with synthesis, the students that write those little itty bitty 4 to 5 sentence body paragraphs just don't have enough support and analysis to really argue a point thoroughly. So I think the magic number is 10. I tell my students to shoot for 10 sentences, not to exceed 12. Otherwise, they're going to bring in extraneous stuff, go for bird walks, and just kind of bloviate about things that they don't need to. So I say shoot for 10. I think that's a good number. So take a look at my first 3 sentences here. It's going to get anchored in the why reason of the argument. So let's see this. Sometimes, and it always seems to be the boys, there's a singular motive on a first date, to have sex by the end of the night. If a first date remains platonic in nature, then there's no moral obligation to inform the other person that a second date is no longer desired. But if intimacy is shared between the couple at any time during the dating process, ghosting that person is not only ethically wrong, it's downright hurtful and heartless. So you can see here that in the argument, you always have echoes of the thesis. You got to be talking about ethics from start to finish in this paper because that's at the heart of the prompt. So this student got anchored in that, and they gave a why reason. Here's the kicker. In the 4th sentence, I tell my students to immediately get into the sources. And here's what my students used for sources. And I probably should have said this from the get-go. So I required them to watch any 2 episodes of MTV Ghosted, any 2 that they wanted. They're free on YouTube for the students that don't have streaming services. And you'd be surprised. Once students get watching this, they watch like season upon season upon season. They love this. And then I had 5 articles that I provided to them. And I said, if those 5 articles don't work for your argument and its defense, then feel free to go locate some of your own articles. So again, if you want any of those resources, teachingwritingcoach@gmail.com, and I'll send those to you. So teachingwritingcoach@gmail.com. So in order for my students not to steal my thunder, I use sources that they cannot use because this can't, when you're modeling and Bob Rossing to the extent that I do, it's not, you don't want students to mimic and mock exactly what you're writing. So I use things that they cannot use. So in the 4th sentence, I'm going right into the episode. And I told students this is probably the easiest maneuver is to go right into the episode. And you'll see that my students did this pretty systematically. And then you link everything to the characters in the episode because you're ultimately focusing on the ethical nature of the characters in that particular episode. So it makes sense logically to start with them. So that's what this student did. So here it is. A good example of this is in season 4, episode 6, in the interactions between Max and Linda. Linda, desperate to find love at all cost, falls head over heels and fawns at Max's chivalry and endless doting. He treats her to a fancy candlelight meal, showers her with affection and praise, comes with an armful of roses, and acts so utterly sincere with every word that he utters. So I would caution this student and say, don't go much further with this. Otherwise, you're going to get super plot heavy and exceed the 12 sentences. So you just give a little bit of context and background, like the essential context and background. So let's wrap this up and get into other sources. But one thing is clear. He only has one motive. And as the night concludes, he gets exactly what he was seeking. So we're done with Max and Linda for now. And one of the things that I had my students practice was incorporating 3 sources into the syllogistic body paragraph to try to synthesize 3. So we have Max and Linda from this episode. Next, I'm going to bring in Pam Shriver. One of the things I like my students to do when they synthesize is to have the sources be in conversation with each other. So look how Pam Shriver speaks back to Max and Linda. So Pam Shriver notes that occurrences like these are common in contemporary dating because behind the screen identities are easy to falsify, which makes it even easier to dupe a date. Now, we'll talk about this. Embedding quotes is important when you're synthesizing, and there's a simple way to get students to do this. I call it the 5-word rule. If a student uses a minimum of 5 words, so not exactly 5, but a minimum of 5 words, and keeps the quote small, it should sound conversational. And if they need to, then they can bracket, which you'll need to show them how to do, as long as they don't over bracket. So far we got Pam Shriver here, and we're going to continue on to the next slide. This is especially true of Max, as we see him fist pounding his buddies for bagging a chick. So here we go. Link it back to Max. Link it back to Linda. Pam Shriver just talked to Max and Linda. Now I'm going to bring in Todd Wright and look at how he speaks to all the sources we've mentioned so far. Todd Wright also asserts that this is occurring because one can divorce themselves from their true self when the interactions are occurring behind a computer screen. Now let's go back to Max, because he did this. This is exactly what he did. Max does divorce himself prior to the first date, and that he portrays himself in a completely different light from his intentions. Wright further comments that boys, more so than girls, engage in these unethical behaviors because the chase has become a game that tosses morality to the sideline. So I got enough support here. I brought enough sources in to fully substantiate my claim. But let's go back to something. If we go to this first premise, have I kept my promise? Do I have a line of reasoning? So reread that real quick. And as you can see, all of my textual support and all of the paraphrasing and quoting is germane to that promise. It does not deviate, nothing extraneous is coming in, and it's fully supported. So all the support and the analysis thus far is linked to that first premise. In the conclusion, I tell my students this: you got to hearken back to ethics, right? Because that's the prompt and that's the thesis. And it only takes a couple of sentences to get there. So in this instance, Max had a responsibility to let Linda know of his intentions. Further, his deceit is reprehensible. Under no circumstances whatsoever can his behavior be justified. So that's perfect. It goes back to the prompt. It goes back to the thesis. It all comes full circle. So this is argued just like arsenic is deadly. My dog ate arsenic. My dog is going to die. It's that cogent in its progression, in its logical sequence. So this is a 4-paragraph essay. And students might ask this: how do I do the next paragraph? And my answer is bust out another syllogism. So this is a totally different student for this one. So thematically, it's going to change. So again, you want 3 sentences so that your argument is central, and you have to articulate a why reason. So let's see how this student did it. In most cases of ethical debate, there's a bit of gray area. Ghosting is not always a clear dichotomy between right and wrong. Sometimes there's an echo of it depends. As an example, in cases of domestic violence or abuse, ghosting is justified. All right, so in terms of the line of reasoning, I'm expecting to have some conversation about domestic violence and or abuse, and then maybe a little discussion about that gray area of when it's acceptable and when it's not. So let's see what we're doing here. And again, This student is starting with one of the episodes, and we'll see how they proceed from there. Again, we're going to shoot for three sources in the syllogistic body paragraph. In an episode featuring Victor and Samantha, Samantha stayed in a dysfunctional couple for fear of losing her life. Over the period of 5 months, she was hospitalized twice due to the abuse she received at the hands of Victor, and even had a knife pressed to her throat. Luckily, Samantha had a very supportive family and friends that intervened and snuck her out of the apartment that she was living in with Victor. She left no note, gave not a single word. She fled in the hopes of never seeing him again. All right, so here's the thing. Once students get into a little bit of plot, they love to just run amok with it. So I tell my students probably no more than 3 to 4 sentences of contextualization of the episode. So they're not quoting the episode, you just paraphrase it a little bit and keep it germane, keep it linked to the first premise, which we did. We're talking about abuse in the first premise, we're talking about abuse in the second premise. So now we're going to introduce this guy, Mark Roble. He should speak to Samantha and Victor. I think I called him Vincent. No, Victor and Victor. Sorry, I thought I called him Vincent at one point in time. So let's see what Mark Roble says here. Mark Roble notes that silent separations are sometimes needed in extreme cases. When abuse and violence is very present, as in the case for Samantha, this qualifies as an extreme case. So again, Samantha is talking to Roble. Roble is talking to Samantha. Get those guys talking to each other. So it continues on to the next slide. Roble goes on to say that those who abuse are owed nothing as far as an explanation is concerned. So a good quote transitions here. Silky smooth, they sound conversational. So we want to try to work in another source here because that was the exercise for my students, was to try to get 3 in here. So we got to finish up Roble. The abrupt disappearance speaks volumes. Victor knew definitively why Samantha left, and he did not pursue her. Nicole Burns, now we're into our third source, suggests that sometimes abusers only wake up and realize the faults of their behavior when something drastic occurs. Burns goes on to state that this almost always happens once the abuser critically wounds their victim or kills them. All right, so again, I'm good. I got a lot of source material in here, a lot of textual support. So let me conclude it and echo back to ethics, echo back to the prompt, echo back to the thesis. And again, I got to focus on Samantha because that's where I began. Samantha was 100% in the right for ghosting Vincent. He did not deserve, nor was he owed an explanation. Speaking to him may have resulted in more violence. Therefore, Samantha did nothing ethically wrong. So one of the things my students have been taught to do as well is in the conclusion of the syllogism, I tell them to drop the hammer like they're a lawyer. So I like to see the short, simple declarative sentences at the end of the syllogism, like pound your fist, pump your chest, be emphatic. You're arguing, right? So finish your argument strong. So those are a couple of examples of how my template of the syllogistic method is used to construct the body paragraphs. And just as a segue here, I probably most of you know I do a lot of PD, and I'm doing a course starting soon called Teach It Right 5-Week Mastermind. So myself, along with probably just 5 teachers, I like to keep the group small, we'll meet in Zoom Sunday nights at 7 Eastern Standard Time for 5 consecutive weeks. And we'll take a look at how my 3 templates, the declarative, the inverted, and the syllogistic, can be used across all of the expository modes. We'll get into AP Lit and Lang, and then we'll also touch upon my academies, like my Nuance Academy, my Word Study Academy, my Sentence Construct Academy, so that we can create total package writers. So I do have a self-paced course. I am offering an alternative grading 2-hour intensive. and that will be posted in the groups as when I offer those. So in brief, I have invented 40 alternatives to traditional grading that are pretty cool and big time savers, and actually more beneficial to students in terms of their growth and maturation as writers. And I do one-on-one consulting and work with districts and departments. So if you want more information on that, visit teachingwritingcoach.com, or you can email me at teachingwritingcoach@gmail.com. So hopefully you found this to be useful and can use it in your classroom. For now, happy teaching and happy writing.